Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jali. I'm very excited to be here to talk about my journey to NgRx-data. And currently, I'm working at a company called Scilabs as a front-end engineer. And I also contribute to Zone.js about 3 years. And now I'm the co-owner of the Zone.js package. And I'm also, from this year, I'm also the trusted collaborator of Angular. So today, I would like to talk about NgRx-data. And this is our real project. I'm working in the Scilabs. This is our cloud service called the Singularity Library. And you can just imagine this web service is just like Docker Hub. So users can share their container images through this web service. But the users are mainly from the supercomputing, high-performance computing, and AI world. So the functionality is just exactly like the Docker Hub. So this is our dashboard, and we have a lot of components to show different aspects of the container images. And of course, this website is built by Angular. And at the very beginning, this project requirement is very, very simple. So we only need to show the read-only information of the container image. So we didn't use any complex solution. We used the most simple, most traditional Angular way to resolve the problem. So just like this, we only have a component. We have some entity service to wrap the HTTP client, and we get the information we want from the backend. So it is very, very simple. Just Angular 101, everybody can do this. And this is a code sample. It's also very simple and straightforward. And every component will hold their own data in the component themselves. And it works very well until we have some new requirements, which is we will allow user to edit the information of the container from the website directly. And the edit itself is very simple. But in this dashboard, we also need some data synchronization, which means if we edit the container in one component, and the other component may also need to be updated at the same time, because one container can exist in another component at the same time. So the desynchronization is a little challenge to us at that time. So at the very beginning, we didn't use NgRx or other third-party state management tool. We just used the behavior subject. We have a middle bridge service which hold a behavior subject. And if one component updated the data, and we will notify this behavior subject service and to emit the updated container information. And the other component will use some RxJS operator, such as switch map or combine latest, to update those information on its own component. So this solution is very simple, and it can work at that time, but it has some flaws. Because in our project, not only one information need to be updated, a lot of information of our container need to be updated, such as our container metadata has the star count, download count, description, and it also has some children information, such as version tags. So everything can be updated from the front end, and such kind of update action can happen everywhere. So all of our components need to write the combine latest or the switch map code everywhere. So finally, our code become a little messy. So I think maybe we need some more elegant solution to resolve such kind of problem. And we found NgRx. And at that time, we didn't have any experience about NgRx. We didn't use NgRx in our previous projects. We only have some very basic knowledge about NgRx, about the concept of NgRx. We know that NgRx store is a single truth of data, and every component just use Selector to access the data from this store. So we think this may be the solution to resolve our data synchronization problem. So we gave it a try and want to make an estimation about how difficult or how long if we migrate our current code base to NgRx. And this is a lot of concepts. This is the NgRx architecture. I think if you use NGRx before, you all know those things. The action, reducer, effects, store, everything about NGRx. And because we don't have any experience about NGRx at that time, so we think to learn so many new concepts and to migrate our code, separate our code in those new concepts, new layers, may cost a lot of time. So we may not be able to finish our migration within the deadline. But we still need the power of the NGRx store. We want the single truth of data to resolve the desynchronization problem. So we think if there are any other library can have the power of NGRx, but don't need, we write a lot of those NGRx concept code. And that is NgRx-data. And in the last year NGConf, Waterbear gave a talk about NgRx-data. And the biggest point is the zero boilerplate of the NgRx. So you don't even need to write the action reducer effects, the data service code, and you can get all the power of NgRx, and which is perfect, which is exactly what we want. And we don't want to write those code, and we get all the power of NgRx. So we make a deeper research about NgRx-data to find out what feature it provided, whether it can satisfy our requirements or not. So here is a list of the NgRx-data features. I will make a quick example and flow to explain those features. And the first one is the biggest reason why we use NgRx-data. So this black box, in fact, it's the NgRx. But as a developer, I don't even realize I'm using NgRx. So the component only talk with a service, a facade service called entity collection service, which provide the CRUD method by default. So the component just called the prebuilt method from this facade service. And behind service, this is just NgRx, but you don't need to understand that. You don't need to know that. So everything happened out of the box. So this is perfect for us at that time. And this is the most basic example how to use NgRx-data. So here is an example to get all the entities from the backend. So what you need to do is just to define entity metadata. Just like a normal OR mapping library, if you use such as some backend library, such as Hibernate, something like that, you will need to define some metadata of an entity. So in this case, the most simplest case, you just need to define the entity name, which is container in our project. That's all. And you need to define facade service. And you don't need to do any real implementation in that service. You just to extend the base class provided by the NgRx-data. And to tell the service, my entity name is container. And that's all. And after you define such kind of metadata from your component, you can use the pre-built, the provided method, the getAll in this case, to dispatch the getAll action, and to use the entities data stream to get all the entities data. So you can see in this code sample, you didn't write single line of the NgRx action, reducer, effects, even the data service code. And you don't need to define your own action name, action type. For example, imagine if you use NgRx, pure NgRx to write such kind of requirement, you need to first to define several type of action, the query all success, query all field, and you need to write your own effect, and you need to write your own reducer, and you need to write your HTTP client service, and you need to write all those NgRx things. But with NgRx-data, you just define the metadata, and it will work. So here is the NgRx-data architecture. So behind the facade service, the entity collection service, and up behind that, it is just NgRx. So every concept, every component of NgRx still exists there. So NgRx-data is not a replacement of NgRx. It just extends NgRx functionality. So it is based on the NgRx. So everything behind the entity collection service is just the most normal way of the NGRX tool. And of course, not only the get all, the query operation, the add, delete, update, and get by key is also very, very simple. From your component, you just need to write the single line of code, and everything is done. You can add a new entity to the collection, and your backend will also be updated. And as long as the delete, update, and you only need to write a few lines of code. You don't need to write all things about NGRX. So here is a quick demo, and this page will call get all at first, and you can click the add here. It will add a new entity, update, and delete. So really, just write a single line of code, and all those things will work. And I will use the get all as an example to explain the relationship between the NgRx-data and NgRx. So here, from the component, first it will call the get all to the facade service, the entity collection service, and the entity collection service will dispatch an action. And the type of this action is NgRx-data query all, and of course, we have entity effects, and this effects will call the date service, and the date service will call the backend. The backend with the HTTP method with get, and the URL with the base URL / the entity's plural names. And after the backend returns some data, and the effects will dispatch another action, which is query all success. And we can see here, it will dispatch another query all success action, which the action payload will contain the container's information from the HTTP response. And the reducer will handle this action payload and generate a new state. And the new state, inside the new state, and we will have the container's data from the action payload. And finally, this new state was saved into the store and triggered selector, and finally the component is updated. So everything in this flow is just a very, very normal NGRX flow. And imagine you don't use NGRX-data at all. You use pure NGRX to implement such kind of business logic. You maybe write the exactly same code, implement the exact same logic with NGRX. You will write the reducer, you will write the effects state service, and you will design the state just like this and provide the same selector. So NgRx-state just provides those most frequently used functionality to developers. And this is a part of the default behavior of the NgRx-state provided. So for example, the get all operation, NgRx-state will define a series of the action which type is end with query all, and it will also generate the HTTP request. The method is get, and the URL is some base URL / the entity's plural names. So if your backend, the REST API URL, match these rules perfectly, you don't even need to write the date service. You don't even need to write the HTTP client code. But if your backend doesn't match that perfectly, you can still customize those behavior very easily. We'll talk about that later. And you may also notice this is this structure finally stored in saved into the store. And you can see the entities was not saved in an array of the entities. Instead, it is saved in such kind of data structure. It is an array of ID and a map of the entity. So if you used the NgRx-entity before, you may notice that this is exactly the NgRx-entity. So what NgRx-entity do? So it will save a collection of entity into this data structure, ID array and a map of entities, instead of a pure array of entities. So the benefit is you can, with this new data structure, you can get a single entity by key. For example, I want to get this entity which ID is 1, you can get this single entity with this map, this structure very effectively. If you use array, you have to loop the array. But if you use this map, this is just a property get operation. And NgRx-entity also have the ID array, so you can still keep the order of the entities collection. And also, NgRx-entity not only provides such kind of new data structure, it also provides an entity adapter to let the user to save the collection of the entity arrays to the new data structure. So in the user's reducer code, basically user just need to call the adapter, the CRUD method provided by the entity adapter, then everything is done. And also, the NgRx-entity provides some basic selectors to let the user easy to use. So this is the updated architecture of the NgRx-data. So NgRx-data, in fact, between the reducer and the store, so here, we have an entity adapter. So NgRx-data is based on NgRx and NgRx-entity. So it has the full power of NgRx and NgRx-entity. So besides that, NgRx-data also provides a lot of other functionalities, such as filter. So this is also a very common request. So with NgRx-data, you don't need to write anything in the component. You just need to define some filter function in the entity metadata. So in this example, I want to filter the entity collection by the name property. I just need to define a filter function here. Then in the component, I can use the filtered entities data stream. Then everything is filtered. And of course, the functionality provided by the NgRx-entity also supported by the NgRx-data. For example, the sort, and you just provide a sort comparator callback to the entity metadata. Then your final entity list will be sorted as well. And in case your entity don't have an ID field, and this is required by the NgRx-entity, and you can also provide the ID selector function to calculate your own ID property. And another common request is loading to tell when your data is ready. This is also internally supported by NgRx-data. So also, you don't need to write a single line code to handle all those functionality. So here is a quick demo. If I click query, you will see there is a loading. And if I input something here, you can see that the list is filtered. So all those functionality is done by the single line of the definition code. And NgRx-data also supports some kind of very complex scenarios. One of them is optimistic update. So in the default behavior is if you want to update something in the front end, and first you must update the backend. And when the backend returns some result, a success or failed, and then you decide whether to update front end or not. But in some use case, you may want to update front end first and then update the backend asynchronously. So NgRx-data provides such kind of functionality out of box. You just need to define such kind of flag, optimistic add, delete, update, and in the entity metadata. So everything will be implemented by default. So why NgRx-data can do that? Because NgRx-data save a change state data structure in the store. So if any operation is uncommitted, it's not finished, and such kind of change state data will be stored in, will be kept in the store. So if some error happens, user can do some operations based on the change state information. For example, if some error happens on the back end, but the front end already be updated, the user can still have the change state information. So user can decide to retry or undo. So this is totally depends on the user's requirement. And NgRx-data will not roll back the error operation for you automatically. It totally depends on the developer. But if you want to do the undo operation, this is also very simple. And you can just use the pure NgRx things to do the automatically undo behavior. And here is a code example. So basically, what you need to do is use NgRx actions stream and to filter any action ends with the operation error. And if you find something wrong, and you just dispatch another action which called undo all, then all the errored action will be rollbacked. So it is such kind of complex case will also very easily be done by the NgRx-data. So this is the demo. If I click update first, you will see that ID1 will be updated immediately, but the loading is still there. And if I click update second field, you will see the ID2 will update it first, and the loading there, and the loading finish, and the ID2 will be rollback. So such kind of case, if you don't use such kind of NgRx-data library, you implement yourself, maybe you need to write a lot of code to handle a lot of cases. So until now, everything is perfect. It seems I don't need to learn a lot of NgRx stuff, the concepts. I don't need to write all those effects to define action code. I can still use all the power of NgRx-entity. So everything is perfect. Until we met some issues, until we met something that we need some deeper customization. And some of the customization is simple. For example, the HTTP URL customization, as I mentioned before. And if your backend URL doesn't match the NgRx-data rule, so you can customize the HTTP URL with this HTTP URL generator. You can provide your own implementation to calculate your own HTTP URL. So this is simple and very straightforward. No NgRx things involved. And another common request is map your data from backend to frontend, because this is very common that the data structure between your backend and frontend will not exactly the same. So you will always need to write some mapping logic. So the NgRx-data recommended way is to provide your own data service. And in your data service, you don't need to do anything about NgRx. You just call the super operation and get the data stream and do the mapping thing there. So this is also very simple and very straightforward, easy to understand, no NgRx involved. And then we met, in our project, we met a real serious problem, which is the pagination. And this is not supported by the NgRx-data by default. And such a case is not, such kind of customization ability is not documented in the NgRx-data. So when we met the pagination requirement, the first thing we want to figure out is where we should save the pagination information in the NgRx store. And before that, we need to figure out what NgRx-data save the data structure saved in the store. So here it is. We can see this is the entities, and we have the IDs and the entities, which is required by the NgRx-entity. And we also have some other properties, such as the filter, loaded, loading, changed state. Those are the things to implement the feature I demoed before. So I want to add the pagination information in this level, because pagination is not a property of entity. This is a property of the entity collection. So we need to find a way to add additional property to the entity collection level. Then we found there is a documentation in NgRx-data called additional collection state. We can define something additional to the entity collection level here. And we just add the page information there. And we soon found it will not work, because such kind of definition is all static. That means if you define something here it will appear in store, but such kind of data will never change because the page information is get from the backend. So you need the page information from backend and finally save to your store. You need every part between the store and the backend. I mean the date service, the effects, the action, the reducer. Every part of NgRx can handle the page information correctly. So you can't do that with this single definition. So at that time, there is no such kind of documentation, and we don't have enough knowledge about the NgRx flow. So that is really hard for us. So we really don't know how to do that. But we already begin our migration, so we have to stick to the NgRx-data. And finally, we have to learn the NgRx concept and to read the NgRx-data source code to find out how to do the real deeper customization. And we found out NgRx-data really did a lot of solid code and provided a lot of extension points. Basically, everything can be override by user. And I will use the pagination as an example to explain how to customize NgRx-data, because this is the most complex one, and it basically involves every part of NgRx. So if you understand how to customize pagination, you can customize everything of the NgRx-data. So the flow will like this, and this part is the same. And when you get some information, entities from the backend, not only the entities information, but also the page information from the backend will return to the front end. And the first one I need to customize is the date service, because this service needs to understand that backend return not only the containers data, but also the page information. So I need to provide my own date service implementation to handle the page correctly. And then the effects get the response and to generate a query or success action. And the payload will contain the entities information. So the effects also need to be customized because it needs to set the page information to the action payload. And fortunately, we don't need to override the entity effects totally, because NgRx-data provides an extension point called a persistent result handler. And this handler, what this handler does is just what we want. It just saves the response from backend and to the action payload. So you can customize what to save, how to save from the response to the action payload. So we just need to provide our own implementation of this persistent result handler and to save not only the container state, but also the pagination data to the action payload. And then we have a query or success action with the correct information. And of course, our reducer needs to read the information from the action payload and to generate a new state. And the new state will contain not only the entity data, but also the page data. So we also need to customize the reducer to do the correct thing, to generate the correct state. And finally, we can get the correct information to the final store. So everything between the backend and the store need to be customized. So after we read the NgRx data and NgRx concept code, we finally understand this flow and how to customize the pagination. And here's the code. I'll bypass that. You can look the workable code from this slide later. And this is a demonstration, and I create query, and we have 2 pages. Every page have 2 items, and the next and the previous will work. So finally, after this pagination customization, we have more confident about using NgRx-data because we finally understand the internal mechanism, how it works with NgRx. And so we continue to customize to handle our other use cases. For example, the conditional error handling. So imagine you have 2 components. component A and component B both call the service the same method, for example, getAll method. And the component A want to show dialog if some error occurs, but component B don't want to show any dialog. And you can implement such a kind of error handling behavior by use catch error ArcGIS operator in each component themselves. That will work. But if you have a lot of components and you want to handle such of error handling behavior in some common generic error service with the power of NgRx action stream, it is very difficult because from the action stream, you only get action payload information. And in the payload, you don't have the information to tell which the error from which component. And fortunately, NgRx-data already considers such as cases, and it has an optional parameter called tag. And basically, all the methods provided by the facade entity collection service have an optional tag parameter. And you can use this tag to do anything. So this tag, you can define anything you want with this tag. And after you pass the tag from this getAll method here, and from your action stream, you can get this tag from the payload. So you can decide to show the error or not. So you don't need to write this error handling code in each component. You can write in the centralized error service. And something NgRx-data was not implemented. The biggest one is the relationship entities. So this one is very important in the business applications because most of the case, we don't have a single entity. We have a lot of entities, and they have relationships. For example, one-to-many relationship, many-to-many relationship. And in that case, for example, in our case, we have one user can have multiple containers, and one container can have multiple versions. So we always want to have such kind of method to get containers by user, or get container with all its children versions. But such kind of functionality was not supported by NgRx-data. So 50% of our migration code is to handle such kind of the entity relationship. And we use a lot of combined lattice rich map to handle that. So if NgRx-data can support that, that would be perfect. And the other things such as validation or the mapping logic I said before are also not supported yet. These are all the nice-to-have features. And before I begin the journey, NgRx-data is a library to reduce the boilerplate of the NgRx code. But after this journey, NgRx-data is a perfect library to encapsulate the best practice of NgRx. And to read the code is really, really great code, and to learn how to write the best case of the NgRx, and how to learn the correct way to use the ArcGIS operator. So read the code is really, really very inspiring journey. And if you are NgRx expert, you may don't need to use NgRx-data because you want the maximum flexibility. But if you are NgRx beginner, just like me, the NgRx-data is a perfect way to let you enter the NgRx world and to let you to use NgRx with some easy built-in functions. And the biggest lesson I learned is even you use NgRx-data, you still need to learn the NgRx concepts if you want to master everything. And thank you, John Papa and Wordbell, for making such awesome library. And that's all from me. Thank you.